Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time.
Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. My name is Jonathan Edens. I am one of your hosts today. I'm a psychiatric PA, and I am joined by my co-host,
Dr. Daniel Binus, and I'm a psychiatrist.
Once again, we have an intriguing episode for you listeners today. This is going to be a little bit more of a unique topic that many of you are likely to be unfamiliar with, but it's an important topic nonetheless. There's a lot of interesting data out there, and we believe that it could definitely have an impact not only on your physical well-being, but of course your mental well-being as well. So, Dr. Binus, why don't you give us a little introduction as to what we will be talking about today?
So we are going to be talking about EMFs, which stands for Electromagnetic Fields, and mental health.
So, what is it about EMFs that warrant a discussion on this podcast? What makes them something that's worthy of our awareness?
Well, EMFs are one of those things that obviously we don't see it. It's invisible, right? But we don't really fully understand the potential implications that it can have on both our physical and our mental health. And I think that this is something that the scientific community is really just starting to scratch the surface on understanding that. And so I think it's something that's really important, because the problem is the science and the technology that we're using that is creating a lot of EMFs in our environment is accelerating every day. In other words, we're exposed to more and more electromagnetic frequencies, and we'll talk a little bit here in just a minute what sorts of EMFs we're exposed to. So we're having more and more of that in our environment and using more and more of that for technology, et cetera. But we don't really know the effect that this is having on our health. And so I think it's a very important topic that we start looking into, delving into, because it's not a good idea to be exposing ourselves to this this stuff that we don't really know in the long term how it's going to affect our health. And then maybe 20 years down the road, we're like, oh boy, we really should have done something different, kind of like tobacco, for example, or other things that were like, oh yeah, it doesn't seem that bad. Maybe it's even good for our health a little bit or something like that. And then years later, you realize, oh man, I wish we would have done the science, the research early before we started using this, right?
Yeah, another example that comes to mind is lead, right? And lead being used in gasoline, and how that is, very clearly the evidence suggests incredibly toxic, particularly for young developing minds. So, Dr. Binus, what are some of the primary EMFs that are of concern?
Yeah, so basically when we talk about EMFs, electromagnetic fields, we're talking about the broad spectrum. Basically, there's going to be like electrical EMFs. There's also magnetic fields. We're talking about radio, TV, computers, microwaves, and then of course we have the visible light spectrum. We have infrared, ultraviolet, we have X-rays, gamma rays. So these are all considered part of that electromagnetic field spectrum. And again, these are waves. And so on the lower end of the frequency, in other words, where the waves are really long, that is where we're going to have like the power lines, and then we go into more of the radio waves, and then the microwaves, then the infrared, then the visible spectrum, then the ultraviolet, then the X-rays. Now the X-rays are, you're getting smaller wavelengths, higher frequency, and then the gamma rays, which is all of those, the ultraviolet, the X-rays, and the gamma rays are considered to be ionizing radiation, which is going to be especially disruptive to DNA and have more likelihood of causing cancer and this sort of thing. But the question that we are wrestling with especially is not so much the ultraviolet, the X-rays, the gamma rays. There's quite a bit of data and knowledge on out there about that and the effects of the health. But more on the lower frequencies, could that also potentially be damaging for our mental and our physical health?
I mean, most people aren't exposed unless you are an X-ray technician, right? You're not necessarily going to be exposed to a lot of X-ray in your daily life. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of my assumption. And so, when you're talking about these lower frequencies, part of the problem is just the amount of exposure, right? The cumulative exposure at high levels over long periods of time without, real where many of us are not really even thinking about it or creating any sort of protection kind of against these or setting up sort of limitations and boundaries around these things, right? So is that kind of my understanding that these things like cell phones and Wi-Fi and microwaves, yeah, they're lower frequency in the same quantities, not necessarily going to be as harmful, but because there's just so much exposure, that cumulative effect could definitely, or I should say, could potentially lead to harm.
Absolutely. That's a big part of it is that cumulative effect. And if you look at the amount that we're exposed to, it's just exponentially more compared to in the last 100 years. And again, the
Yeah.
question is, could this be having an effect on our health? And then the other big factor when we look at any kind of EMF exposure is when you are close to the source of that, then the exposure intensity is much higher. In other words, if I have my cell phone like right up to my head, that exposure intensity is going to be much more potent than even if I hold it a couple of or a few inches further away. And the reason for that is because it's actually, if you look at the equation that shows us the intensity and the effect of any kind of radiating exposure, it's actually a squared. And so essentially,
It's exponential.
yeah, it's exponential the closer that you get it. And so that's the other piece of this. Yes, it's the net effect, but it's also how close are we getting to our devices and the various things, and how could that be affecting us?
So I understand that the FCC has some answers on this potential question of whether or not EMFs are actually harmful for us. What are your comments on that?
Well, we do have to really think about how they established their safety standards. But before we do, I just want to mention when we think about these EMFs of concern, I want to give a few examples because we've touched on some of the examples of where these fields come from, but I want to flesh that out just a little bit. So when we think about electric fields, for example, some of the common sources for the EMFs from electric fields would be power lines, also electrical wiring, ungrounded electronics, power strips, cords and chargers, lamps, and lighting. So that would be kind of for the electric fields, okay? But when we talk about the magnetic fields, on the other hand, some sources of that would be circuit breaker boxes, also especially if there's grounding issues, faulty wiring, electric stoves, refrigerator motors, hair dryers, metal on water pipes, or I'm sorry, current on metal water pipes, and then transformers and motors. And so sometimes we just think about like cell phones and that sort of thing, but we also need to remember that electricity and magnetic fields are also a source of EMFs. And then there's one aspect that we don't always think about, even with electricity, and that is what we call dirty electricity. Have you ever heard of dirty electricity before?
I think, but I think it was probably from you.
All right. So there's clean electricity, but then there's dirty. So basically, with dirty electricity, this occurs when the electricity is manipulated into other types of electricity, or it's transformed to another voltage, or when its flow is interrupted. Okay. So basically, normally when an electric current is flowing at I believe it's 60 hertz in America, then it'll flow nicely. It'll be relatively clean. But then if you have some of these issues where the flow is interrupted for one reason or another, this makes the electrical, instead of having a nice clean wave, it actually starts sending these spikes of electricity that, instead of being in that 60 hertz range, it like can spike really high. And this frequency, like where it can go up even to sometimes 2000 hertz or even 100,000 hertz, it most easily couples with our bodies and gives us a high risk of damage. So, one thing that I realized very quickly when I had my house looked at, because I had someone come out and measure the EMFs in our house, is that we actually have a fair amount of EMFs coming in from dirty electricity. I was like, well, where is that coming from? And the man who was doing the measuring, he pointed out that, oh, look, your neighbor has solar panels. And so the inverter, the way that works, it basically feeds back electricity into the grid, and that interrupts that clean wave of electricity, and so it causes these spikes and these jolts of electricity, which again can be harmful for the body. So other sources of dirty electricity would be pool and well pumps with energy efficient variable or adjustable speed motors, even energy efficient light bulbs, overhead fixtures, LED and most tubular light fixtures, dimmer switches, also computers, even laptops like I have in my lap right now. And then chargers, like even electric car chargers, induction stove tops, smart meters, and smart appliances. So you can see a lot of these smart devices and electrical saving devices actually can create dirty electricity, which can be very harmful. And then that fourth element, the radiation, the wireless radiation one, this is also another form of EMFs, and many of our listeners are going to be most familiar and thinking most about this. That would be like cell phones, cell phone towers, Wi-Fi routers, smartwatches, Bluetooth devices, and microwaves and the like.
Yeah, so everything we use in the world, Dr. Binus, is trying to kill us. Is that
well, we got to look at the evidence to see, right? So we're going to get into that here in just a minute. But you had asked earlier, about EMFs, if they're really harmful, and the FCC at this point is basically saying, probably not, and they say basically, look, it's really. If you look at a microwave, how it heats food, then it's probably not too dangerous, and it's not going to heat up your tissue too rapidly. And so, because of that, it's probably pretty safe. And it's kind of interesting because when you look at how they established the safety standard was established all the way back in 1996. Now, Jonathan, I don't know about you. I think you were alive in 1996, right?
I was, yes. Thanks.
Okay, good. Now, I
wasn't that old, but I was alive.
Okay, good. So that's what I was going to say. I don't know if you remember 1996, but if you remember 1996, what kind of devices and things that technology did we have back then?
We had TVs and radios.
Yes.
We had, I don't know if like Palm Pilots and stuff, kind of the earliest cell phones may have been available. There were, there were computers, but they were not everybody owned one, right? So fairly rudimentary stuff, microwaves, toasters, things of that nature, light bulbs, but yeah, we didn't have all of this extra, especially that last category that you described, the wireless radiation. We definitely didn't have all of that.
Right. Yeah. And to me, it's just amazing that we're establishing our safety standards based on this archaic, non-technological age back in 1996. And we're saying, okay, well, it must be safe. And, it's interesting because the reason they even say that it's safe is because they've done research on what they call SAM. Now, SAM stands for specific anthropomorphic mannequin. And basically what they wanted to do to test safety is to give between 6 and 30 minutes of exposure to whatever the EMF producing
Device or whatnot.
device was. And so basically what they would do with SAM is they would put this temperature probe in the middle of the brain of Sam. I mean, Sam is not a real human or anything like that, but you can look it up online. You can see it's basically kind of this mannequin, and they essentially put water in there, and then they want to see, does that temperature actually raise in the middle of the brain when exposed to this EMF radiating device, right? And so basically what they said is that if the temperature inside SAM does not raise more than 1 degree Celsius, then it must be safe. And so, yeah, of course, the question is, well, why 1 degree Celsius? Well,
there's a lot of questions. That's not the only one, but that is one.
That's one of the major questions, right?
Why is our brain made out of water? I mean, yes, the brain has a lot of water in it, but it's exclusively water, I guess, in this particular mannequin.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And of course, so now it is not just water; it also has some salt and sugar in it. Okay, but
okay, all right, fair enough.
just in case some of our listeners are like, hey, yeah, okay, so it has a little salt and sugar in there too. But anyway, so why 1 degree Celsius? Well, the researcher who developed these, what they call the SAR ratings, his name was Om Gandhi at the University of Utah, observed that rats whose brain temperature increased eventually reached a point where they stopped eating, okay? And so they said because rats stop eating at 1 degree Celsius when their brain temperature is increased by 1 degree, that must mean it's unsafe at that point. And so that's how they've established that this is not a safe standard for radiation. But one of the major issues with that is that the primary mechanism, as we've been researching more over the years on the effects of EMFs and health, the primary mechanism for damage to our tissue and damage to our health is not based on temperature. It's not because we're boiling inside that we're actually having health problems from EMF exposure. No, it's because there's specific cellular and tissue damage that starts going on, again, with that cumulative effect, especially over time, and that chronic exposure.
So did you want to go into what some of those mechanisms of harm specifically are?
Yeah. So basically, when we look at that, what we really understand is the primary mechanism of harm is going to be oxidative stress. And so there's different theories, but for the most part, most researchers that are experts in the field of EMF, like Dr. Martin Paul, for example, they hypothesize that EMFs will actually trigger an excess release of calcium, and in the long run, this will actually lead to oxidative damage, more reactive oxygen species, and then this will damage the DNA, damage the cell, other structures of the cell as well, and then cause problems with the tissue. And so this can especially be important with tissues that have high concentration of voltage-gated calcium channels. And what's interesting is that they found that it seems like calcium channel blockers, like medications that we use for even treating hypertension, for example, if you use those medications, this seems to block a lot of the ill effects of EMFs. And this is one of the reasons for this hypothesis, okay?
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that tissues that have very high concentration of the voltage-gated calcium channels, which are hypothesized to be more sensitive to the EMF activity, are the brain, the heart, and the reproductive organs. And so what we notice also is that these are also the very same tissues that seem to be more susceptible in the long run to the health effects when it comes to EMF exposure.
I value those organs quite a bit, Dr. Binus.
That's why we're laughing, but this is a serious conversation, right? I mean, it's one of those things that even for me, as I'm reviewing this, because I gave this lecture for the first time last year, and you kind of just like out of sight, out of mind, but I'm like, man, this is a big deal. We need to be thinking about this and taking measures to actually mitigate our risk. By the way, one interesting thing, because we would think that, well, wouldn't there be more press on this if it really was a danger? We have to understand, a lot of research is done based on funding. And when we think about where the
Yeah.
money is here, I mean, think about big tobacco back in the 60s, for example, the 50s, 60s. It's like you got to be really careful about where the research is coming from. And one really interesting thing that one researcher has broken down is that he looked at the funding biases. In other words, what he found when he looked at this is that for those studies that were funded by the industry, in other words, by like the tech industry, that there was a 72% of those studies showed no effect. In other words, no health effect. Okay. But then when you looked at the non-industry funded studies, 67% showed an effect and only 33% showed no effect as far as harms to health.
Right.
And so basically the opposite, right? So
Yeah.
again, we have to look at where the funding is coming from. And even in 2010, there was a UC Berkeley. So this is a reputable university here in California, University of California Berkeley review. And they analyzed both the results and the designs of 23 studies that were related to EMFs, and they compared this to the source funding. And the conclusion was that among the 10 higher quality studies, we found a harmful association between phone use and tumor risk. The lower quality studies, which failed to meet scientific best practices, were primarily industry funded. So again, we have to be really careful where this research data is coming from.
Yeah, and that's when you break down the funding biases, particularly of the industry-funded ones. 72% had no effect and 28% showed an effect. That's of the published studies,
Yes.
right? Like there's an incentive bias for them if they don't get the result that they're looking for to not publish, which is another trick of the pharmaceutical industry, right? If they don't like what they see, oftentimes they just won't publish it.
That's very true. Absolutely. So, yeah, it's pretty obvious to me that there are concerns. And again, I don't want to over dramatize this. This isn't everything,
Sure.
right? But we have to be
Yeah.
aware that this is likely having some impact on all of us on some level or another. And one thing that I really want to emphasize is, there's the majority of people are probably going to do pretty well, at least for a good long time. But there's one issue that we need to keep in mind, which is the lag effect. In other words, it's not just how much we're getting right now, but how many years are we being exposed to that? And again, in 10, 15, 20 years, are we going to suddenly see more and more of that effect of cancer and other issues coming up? And then number two, certain populations are going to be particularly vulnerable, including people that already have other health issues, maybe genetic issues, or even children. And we're going to get into that later. But yeah, there's actually some decent data that is starting to show that there are some specific harms that are probably occurring for some of those vulnerable populations.
And what are some of those? What are some of those effects specifically?
Well, specifically, we are starting to see significant evidence for reproductive harm, infertility, for example. Also, cancer, especially for brain and childhood leukemias. And then some evidence that possibly there might be a link with autism. Some kids vulnerable to ADHD, probably increases the likelihood of ADHD. Also, insomnia, impaired sleep, anxiety and mood disorders, and then even neurodegenerative disorders like cognitive disorders such as Alzheimer's and various
Parkinson's.
Parkinson's and that sort of thing. Exactly. So we can kind of go into those briefly just to touch on some of the data and findings in those one by one, if that's okay with you, Jonathan.
That's fine. Let's do it.
All right. So, first, reproductive harm, infertility. So, we do know that in general, infertility problems are rising worldwide. And it appears that wireless radiation reduces sperm motility, sperm count, sperm viability and quality, and even testosterone. There are at least 6 meta analyses evaluating more than 200 separate studies that have determined that cell phone radiation is significantly harmful to sperm. And women can also experience reduced progesterone levels and menstrual problems. And think about it this way, where do we tend to carry our cell phones?
Pretty close to the goods.
Exactly.
In our pocket.
Exactly. And so that's probably not the best place to carry our cell phone. And Grant, look, I have a cell phone. I know that we all, most all of us, feel like we need a cell phone to even function in today's world. So I'm not suggesting that we just all go and throw our cell phones in the trash. But again, this is about awareness so that we can make wise decisions on how to use our technology. One of the scariest things in my mind is just the cancer risk, I think. So, and one of the things that we see here is generally speaking, the latency period that I was talking about earlier, the latency effect is about 20 years or maybe even a little bit more. And again, we even see this with tobacco, right? So in other words, it takes being exposed to something that's harmful. The body is pretty good at dealing with it for a while. But eventually, as we get older and as the risk or the overall exposure continues, then we can start becoming more vulnerable. So there's a 2015 Swedish study that shows the odds of developing glioma rose with increased cell phone use. And then in 2018, this was in England, they actually found a recent doubling of glioblastoma incidence, particularly in the frontal and temporal brain regions, which again may be associated with that cell phone risk. And it seems like anyone who begins using a cell phone younger than age 20 seems to have the highest risk.
Oof.
Yeah.
And these studies were obviously done with older, probably more like 3G, probably not even 4G cell phones, huh?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And it's not just the cell phones. Actually, they're showing there's some studies that are showing even with a radio towers, for example. So they show that the closer you get to radio towers, the more your incidence of cancer. For example, this was a cell tower operation, and so cell towers are also not, you don't want to be too close to a cell tower. This actually showed a significant increase in both breast cancer and brain cancer, especially. But overall, cancer, all cancers combined, were also significantly higher. Breast cancer risk was 23 times higher in this study. And that was in the highest exposure, category. And then brain cancer risk was 121 times higher. So obviously significant. They did one study that showed that for childhood leukemia, so this was actually at the Vatican. There's a radio tower at the Vatican. And they found that the closer these children lived to the Vatican radio tower, the higher incidence of leukemia they developed. So again, to me, we want to be aware because we can't see. We don't always know like where's our closest cell phone tower or radio tower or what have you, and so it can be just a little scary.
Any other mental health disorders, Dr. Binus, you wanted to touch on?
Yeah, so basically, again, like I mentioned briefly earlier, autism. I mean, obviously, we just see a huge rise in that. In 2000, we had 1 in 150 children with autism. Now it's 1 in 40. So just well, actually, it might even be higher now because that 1 in 40 number was in 2016. So, but jumping, just in 16 years, 1 in 150 to 1 in 40. Again, I'm not saying EMFs are the only cause for that, right? I think autism and most disorders are multifactorial, including cancer, including ADHD, et cetera. But again, could this be playing a role? I think especially because we've been seeing this huge rise in EMF exposure over the last several decades, it could possibly be playing a role. And again, ADHD, there was actually a German study that showed that those children who had the highest exposure to EMFs had an increased risk of ADHD symptom. And even exposure to cell phones prenatally could be associated possibly in this other study with behavioral difficulties like hyperactivity and acting out and that sort of thing. So it's not just after the child is born, but even beforehand. And then when we talk about sleep, what's interesting is that the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin and helps us to induce sleep, seems to be also sensitive on some levels to EMFs, and it almost senses EMFs as light oftentimes. And so part of the issue, I mean, we always talk about the blue light from our screens, right? And that shuts down the melatonin secretion. But it's possible that just EMFs by themselves, exposure to that could also be part of what impairs the melatonin production as well. And then anxiety, mood disorders. For example, workers exposed to broadcast radio frequencies have been shown to experience increased anxiety, social anxiety, sleeplessness, and hostility. I don't know if that was because of what was on the radio programs or no.
It was politics. That's what it was.
Yeah, that must have been the problem, right? Yeah, and like I said earlier, there is some evidence that possibly even increased risk of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, aka Lou Gehrig's disease. So occupations with high EMF exposure seems to be significantly higher related to these disorders. So, I don't want to leave our listeners completely depressed. What do you think, John? Should we just end the podcast?
Yeah, a little bit of a somber episode.
I know, right?
So what can we do about this, Dr. Binus?
Yeah. Well, the good news is there are actually some pretty simple things that we can do. It does require being intentional and taking some steps. But one thing that I do want to mention before that is, children are actually the most vulnerable population when it comes to EMFs. Why? Well, especially from a mental health perspective, because their skulls are thinner. And we know that if there's any kind of barrier in between the EMF and the tissue that is at risk, that helps to stop the EMF or at least reduces the exposure. The skulls of children are thinner. Their heads
They're
are
also not completely closed
right
for a while.
Yeah, exactly. When they're first born, absolutely. The heads are smaller. So that means the radiation can actually penetrate more deeply and cause more harm. Because there's also less myelin, which myelin is the fat sheath that covers the axons of nerve cells. There's less of that in the childhood brain. There's going to tend to be more radiation absorption because the fat will actually help it to kind of shield the neurons from that exposure. But because there's less fat in the childhood brain, you're going to have more vulnerability. And again, the lifetime exposure that's going on with children nowadays because they're born into this EMF soup, so to speak. So the lifetime of exposure, to these kids that are born in kind of this EMF soup, so to speak, is a big vulnerability factor as well. But yes, the good news is there are actually things that we can do, and 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 really, what I want to first and foremost emphasize is that we should, instead of just assuming that things are safe because we can't see it and we see no immediate effect, I think we need to practice what is called the precautionary principle. In other words, the Science Direct defines this as if a product, an action, or a policy has a suspected risk of causing harm to the public or to the environment, protective action should be supported before there is complete scientific proof of a risk. In other words, we should err on the side of safety, basically, when it comes to protecting ourselves and our families. So, what are some of the things that we can do to mitigate our risk? Well, we can simply start with a screening question. Um, do we feel worse in certain environments? In other words, do you feel worse when you get home? Like, when you get home, do you suddenly feel like more fatigued? Do you get more headaches? Do you have more nightmares, more insomnia? If you go somewhere else on a trip, do you actually feel better? Like when you're going camping, for example, So if there's aspects like when you come home that you're feeling worse, like you're having more pain, you're having more insomnia, you're having more of symptoms, that might be a sign that there's some significant EMF exposure going on in the home. So that's one simple question you can ask. And then, ideally, you do want to take the time to assess your house and or whatever site you're concerned about. Now, that is not always a cheap undertaking, and this is now certainly you can get your own EMF meters and all of that, and I'm by no means any expert on doing that, and I feel like I would get all sorts of weird readings, so I haven't even really tried that. But like I mentioned earlier, I have had someone come into my house, and it was pretty fascinating to watch him go through the whole process. And actually, the guy, I'll just mention his name because he's a good guy, and you can call him if you're interested in him doing an assessment, especially if you're in California. Eric Windheim. And he came in, and he's had years of experience doing this. And he had, several different ways of measuring. Again, it's not just the radio frequency that we're looking at, but it's also the electrical exposure and then the magnetic field exposure as well. And so it does take some financial investment, but I think it's worthwhile because once you identify what your risk is, which again is most important, of course, you think about work, that's important, but what's most important is our home. Because that is where we're going to spend generally most of the time. And even if we don't spend the majority of the time there, usually we're at least sleeping there. And that is really the most important aspect because in sleep is where our bodies are repairing the damage that was done during the day. Okay. And so we really want to create what we call a sleep sanctuary. And we want to identify what are the things that could be causing, the radiation, the EMF exposure. And basically, what Eric did then is he not only measured and recorded that, but then he assigned a risk level. In other words, he said, okay, well, this is a pretty significant EMF exposure in this part of the house, or this is, and then you can start figuring out what the source is, because depending on the various type of radiation that or EMF that you're measuring, you can start to hypothesize where that's coming from, and then you can eliminate. And there are specific things that you can do. So you can remove certain things that you don't need, right? You can replace certain things. In other words, some of these smart meters, for example, maybe you could replace it with an old school one that isn't so dangerous, even though it's not as smart. It might be actually a lot safer for your health. One of the biggest things is creating distance. Remember how I said that exponential increase in risk or in intensity is related to distance. And so just creating a little more distance can exponentially drop down your risk for health problems. Of course, you want to reduce usage, repair wiring, filter and shield. For example, on my cell phone, I have, one of these shields that actually helps to protect the EMFs coming toward my body. And so, yeah, I have my cell phone, but it's shielded. And so the EMFs are actually focused away from my body instead of coming into my body. And then, like I said, I think one of the most important things that we can do is create a sleep sanctuary. And what do we do for that? Well, we can use battery powered clocks near our bed instead of like electronic, well, I should say like cell phones and that sort of thing, especially if our cell phones are not in airplane mode. I mean, I actually do have my cell phone next to my bed, which probably isn't ideal, but I always put it on airplane mode at night, right? We really want to make sure that if you have Wi-Fi, which ideally you should get rid of actually, but if you have it, you definitely want to turn it off at night because that Wi-Fi, again, is a source of EMF. Eric, when he came and did our assessment, he even told me about the story where there was a young man, actually as a boy, and his father didn't know why he was having all these problems in school with ADHD and various issues. And so Eric did an assessment of the house, discovered that there was the Wi-Fi router was actually underneath his bed. And so when they removed that, the boy actually he started improving dramatically in school, his behavior, his concentration, and everything. It's pretty interesting when you can even see some of these case studies, right, of improvement. So yeah, basically you want to turn off all bedroom affecting electrical circuits. Ideally, you want to shield the radio frequency. You want to use beds without metal. Otherwise, your body starts to become, kind of this conduit for the EMF. It just starts flowing through you more easily. And then you want to make sure there are no elevated magnetic fields as well. And, one thing that I think can be helpful is trying as much as possible to get out into more of a country setting if you can. Now that we can always bring the EMFs to us, so it doesn't automatically guarantee, but sometimes it's easier to get less exposure. And especially you want to think about shielding your body again during pregnancy. I think that's really important. You want to keep personal devices at least 1 foot from your body. And then when you use your laptop, ideally you want to use it with a grounded 3-prong plug, which again will make the EMFs actually flow out. You want to minimize your Bluetooth devices because that actually will create more of that EMF exposure. And then you want to minimize any kind of dimmer switches, baby monitors, get rid of CFL light bulbs as well, and cordless phones. So I know that's a lot of information, but hopefully
a little bit. I'm just looking around my room and I'm like, I got a lot of work to do.
An EMF soup that we're in right now, right?
Yeah. Well, this is any closing remarks, Dr. Binus?
Well, yeah, I don't want to discourage our listeners by any stretch, but I think we do need to be aware of the potential danger. And I'm also not trying to be a complete alarmist here, but I do believe there's enough evidence that I'd rather err on the side of caution, especially when it comes to our families and our children, rather than 20, 30 years down the road being like, oh man, look at how much this has messed up our health, and only, if we only knew. And so I think as much as possible, we don't want to be extreme, but we want to create safe environments, especially when it comes to sleep, like I said, and especially protect our children.
Yeah, when I'm thinking about this discussion, I'm reminded of many of our other episodes where the concepts we discuss, they can sort of synchronize fairly nicely. Amanda and I recently had a discussion about this concept of slow living, and I don't know if that episode is going to air before this one or whatnot, right? But the concept of limiting your EMF exposure, this idea of slow living, we have talked about in the past of limiting nighttime screen time, and a variety of other topics we've discussed too regarding lifestyle. There's an overlap between them, right? And so if you're adopting some of those other things, it might be easier to incorporate this as well. For me, I can say personally that it's probably going to be a little bit harder, being that I am such a tech guy. But it's definitely got me thinking about some changes that probably need to be implemented.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it doesn't mean we can't use technology, but it's just trying to use it in a wise way that will really benefit us, have a net benefit rather than more of that harm. So,
well, thank you so much for your insight on this particular topic, Dr. Binus. I hope our listeners have found this inspiring in ways, right? But perhaps convicting in other ways, and use this information to better their own life, their own mental health, their own well-being. And we look forward to you guys listening in next time. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe. Your engagement will help us reach more people who need encouragement. To hear more episodes, learn about our other mental health resources, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.